Well, good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted that you've joined us, and I want to thank everyone for taking the time out to be here. So, welcome to SciTec 2018. Welcome to those who are part of the nuclear industry, but a special welcome to those who are not part of the nuclear industry. You're really welcome, and we really need you to be part of this journey. So, I want to open today by talking about the disruptive benefit of innovation. When I was a PhD student at the University of Manchester, I remember walking down the corridor one day and seeing one of my colleagues unpacking a box. It was a funny-looking typewriter that had some wires out of the back that he seemed to plug into a television set. And I couldn't resist going in and seeing what he was looking at. And it was the first BBC microcomputer that the School of Materials at the University of Manchester had ever bought. And I ended up using this bit of equipment in my research on nickel-based single crystal superalloys for aerospace. I used this, I wrote a graph plotting package, I did curve fits on it, I even did image analysis on this little computer. But little did I know the impact that this little machine, this little box of tricks, would have not only on my life, but also on every sector in every part of the world. Let's just look at one example. Think about the press sector. Think about the press sector and see, has my microphone gone off? All right. That's right. The disruption of technology. Thank you. Think about the press sector. Here you can see an experiment at the Guardian newspaper in 1966 where they're trying to see how fast they can send text across the Atlantic to the New York Times. And they achieved an amazing 1,000 words per minute. Well, of course, technology has completely transformed this sector. Communications, the old printing presses we don't see. In fact, you don't even need to read your newspaper as a paper form. You can read it on an app on an iPad. That sector, when you think about it, industry is really governed by two things. It's governed by the activities it does and the infrastructure or the assets that it operates. And this is an example where the activities of the newspaper sector haven't actually changed. Good journalism is still good journalism. But the assets by which they deliver that business have transformed out of all recognition. The digital age has transformed that. We're here in Liverpool, in the dock area, just down the road from the Albert Docks. Here you can see what the Albert Docks used to look like. Here's a sector equally completely transformed, this time by containerization. In 1961, 30,000 people were employed on the Liverpool docks. Over 13,000 stevedores were loading cargo into ships in all the docks along here, including the Albert Dock. This whole area got transformed. In 1971, the docks closed because these docks were inappropriate for the large containerization programs. You can hear all about it at the Museum of Liverpool. Completely changed. But when you look at the Albert Dock today, it pretty much looks the same. In this case, the assets of this industry, the docks, the warehouses and so on, are still the same. But the activities that are happening in them have completely transformed. So now this is a place of leisure, it's a place of business, it's a place of art, but the infrastructure is the same, the activities have changed. I just want to point out one other industry that has transformed, but in a different way. The airline industry. The Comet aircraft, made of aluminium, looks pretty much like the latest 787 Dreamliner aircraft. Wings, it's larger, the engines have changed somewhat, but basically the assets of an aeroplane are still the same thing, and the activities are still the same as well. But that industry has had to incrementally develop. So today, rather than fully aluminium aeroplane, only 20% of the aircraft is aluminium for the Dreamliner. In fact, most of it is advanced composites. And the materials that I was doing research on in 1983 or 84 are now in the turbines. And it's just incrementally developed. The assets and the activities are the same. So let's look at our sector. Let's look at the energy sector and think about that. So the oil and gas sector has always been impacted by the variation of the oil price. You know, when the price goes up, we experience queues to get our petrol or our diesel for our cars and so on. When the price goes down, there's a big impact. And of course, in 2014, there was a massive reduction in the oil price, really driven, certainly in part, by oversupply. And that oversupply came particularly from the US with oil fracking, and the price just dropped through oversupply. OPEC decided they would continue to supply oil into the market. There was an excess of 500,000 barrels, and the impact was a massive shock to the system globally. In this country, the impact of that was a sector that employed in 2014 350,000 people. Today employs about 270,000 people, a drop of 25%. But the oil and gas sector are fighting back. They are talking about a sector deal worth £1 trillion up to 2035 and setting up 3 new centres of excellence to drive greater investment and greater benefit. One on underwater engineering, one on transformative technologies, and one on decommissioning that will give a return of investment of over £100 billion by 2035. A real vision for the future. Let's think about clean energy now. Offshore wind is expanding incredibly at the moment, and we've also seen massive cost reductions in electricity from offshore wind. The targets that industry set themselves for cost reduction have been exceeded year on year. They are pulling together their sector deal, which is likely to include 50 billion investment in infrastructure, a vision to double the amount of electricity in this country from offshore wind, taking us up to 30 gigawatts by 2030, an increase in the workforce from about 11,000 today up to about 27,000 in 2030. Again, a vision for the future for this sector. So what's our future in nuclear, and where are we at the moment, and what are the factors that are impacting on us? Well, as you know, nuclear is an incredibly important part of the low-carbon, clean energy mix in this country. In last year, we provided over 20% of the electricity into the UK system. That's over 40% of our clean electricity into the UK. Nuclear energy is incredibly important to this country. We support almost 90,000 jobs today in the civil and defence sectors. And as a sector, our direct and indirect contribution to the UK economy is over £12 billion every year. This is a significant sector, but we face challenges. So thinking about our reactors, the AGR, the Advanced Gas-Cooled Reactor Fleet, is aging. Within 5 years, the first reactors will start to shut down, those at Dungeness B and Hinkley Point B. By 2030, all of the AGRs will have shut down, including this twin station at Torness. But we're replacing that generating capacity with new nuclear build. Hinkley Point C project is off and running. Discussions on Wilver continue, and at Moorside as well. But make no mistake, these are challenging times for new nuclear build. The costs associated with building new nuclear power stations are huge, and finding the investment to back that up is almost impossible. So as a sector, in terms of clean electricity into the grid, we face a challenge. We face a challenge of closures, and we face a challenge of cost. And that's why in our emerging nuclear sector deal, industry is committed to drive out 30% of the costs of new nuclear build by 2030. We need to think how we're going to do that. What about decommissioning and waste management? Well, that's continuing around the country. The Magnox stations are being decommissioned. Here at Sellafield, programs are changing. Plant is closing. The mission to reprocess our nuclear fuel will stop in 2 to 3 years' time. Thought that reprocesses all of our AGR oxide fuel will shut later this year or early next year. So again, this faces closure and change to our mission. The cost of decommissioning equally need to come down, and again, the sector deal for the nuclear industry has committed to drive out 20% of the costs of decommissioning by 2030. Closure and costs represent a challenge here as well. So, 2 challenges for nuclear as we stand here in 2018 that we need to think about. What are we going to do to drive growth in our sector, and how are we going to address these challenges? Let me look at this in a slightly different way. Industries change and industries go through transformation. They have to, because either their assets or their activities or both are threatened. We looked at the aircraft industry, where the assets and the activities continue, but they need to change incrementally or progressively to reinvent themselves, to keep ahead of the game, to drive the competition. We thought about the newspaper sector and journalism, where the core activity is the same, but the assets have changed completely. That requires creative change. We thought about where we are here in the Liverpool docks, where the assets are the same, but that industry, that sector has to change completely and put those assets to new use, inventive change. Where does nuclear sit in 2018? My view is we sit in this box. There is a threat to our assets through closure, and there is a threat to our activities through cost. And we need to think about that, because it is inevitable by 2030, unless we do something different, this sector will decrease and will not provide the contribution either to clean energy that we need or to jobs and the economy. So I just want to pause there, and I want you to think about that, because if we do nothing, by 2030, there will be a smaller contribution of nuclear energy into our grids. There will be fewer people working in this sector. We have to address that twin challenge of cost and closure. Now, some of you were here at last year's SciTec Conference, and we had an international panel, and our chairman asked the question, if you could do one thing to reduce the cost of nuclear energy, what would it be? The answer that came back was, if it's going to be safer, it's going to be more expensive. And I remember at the back of the room, Dame Sue Ian stood up and waved her papers, and she said, that cannot be the right answer. That cannot be the right answer. And I really reflected on that in the days and the weeks that followed that conference. And I thought to myself, that cannot be the right answer. So what are we going to do about it? So what I decided to do was to host a roundtable discussion with all of the key lead nuclear organisations that have programmes to deliver. But I wanted to invite to that other sectors who have experienced change and who are driving innovation into their sectors. And I wanted us, as nuclear people, to learn from them. So we launched something called Big Tech. And in November last year at the Royal Academy, we hosted the Big Tech Innovation Roundtable. I was interested in how big technologies could impact our sector, robotics, advanced manufacturing, digital, and all of that sort of stuff. So as I say, we invited all of the nuclear sector who have programs that they have to deliver. They're responsible. We invited the Office for Nuclear Regulation. There are all the logos. You can see who was there. But equally, we had pretty much an equal number of non-nuclear organisations. We had satellite applications, digital, we had medical, we had Crossrail, we had construction, shipbuilding, loads of varied sectors who talked to us about how they do innovation. And what became very clear very quickly is it's not just about technology. What came out of our discussion were 5 key themes that will drive cost reduction, the cost reduction that we have to do as a sector. And those 5 themes are underpinned and enabled by regulation, enabling regulation. And here are the themes. It is about technology, but it's also about culture, and it's about leadership. It's also about collaboration, new collaborations and wider supply chains. It's also about how do we manage our programs and how do we manage risk in our sector. And it's also about how do we finance and build confidence in the investor community in our projects. We ran 5 workshops led jointly by a nuclear lead and a non-nuclear lead. And out of those 5 workshops came a series of recommendations that can help us to deliver the ambition of the sector deal for cost reduction in this sector. Today, we're bringing 2 of those together because these aren't isolated, they have to work together. What good is technology if you don't have the leadership to drive it into your program and plan it in? So today is all about innovation through collaboration, and that's why you're here. Whether you're nuclear or not, we need to break out and collaborate in new ways to learn, drive innovation into our programs. So, here's a picture of the nuclear industry as I see it. We have a number of large organisations delivering their programs for the sector. As a sector, we almost operate in a silo as well, because sometimes we think we're special. What could we learn from others? What I learned at Big Tech is that there are collaborations that seem unlikely to start with, but they drive economic growth and they drive transformation. The Digital Catapult talk to us about what they do in the food industry. They talk to us what they do in the retail industry, the health sector, in the diamond industry, and how they're transforming those sectors. Unlikely collaborations you might think, but collaborations that are transforming sectors that haven't changed for years. So today, I want you to think about new collaborations. As you go around here, as you see technologies and so on, think about who you're with. Talk to people you don't know. Think about who could I collaborate with that I haven't collaborated with before. Secondly, the nuclear sector has got some fantastic technology. Technologies that could use nuclear materials in new ways. Technologies that can push the lifetime of our nuclear reactors out as far as we can, safely and securely. Technologies around new nuclear fuels for the future, and so on. But one of the things I learned at Big Tech was in many ways we have fallen behind the technology curve as a sector. I learned about technologies that I didn't even know existed. Satellites that can monitor ground movement to such an accuracy, they can plot the development of Crossrail under the streets of London as it progresses. Satellites that can work with digital to transform our transport network and to unblock our roads without building new roads. New technologies that can actually transform. And so again, today you will see technologies that you won't have seen before. And I want you to think about and discover what those technologies could do for you. Go into those zones with an open mind. Thirdly, the nuclear sector has got some massive challenges that we have to face. What good is technology or collaboration unless we're actually delivering change on the ground and we're connecting the challenge to the technology and bringing it together? So today, as you go around, think about the challenges that your sector face, where you work, the challenges on your desk, and think about how could you connect technology to meet that need at reduced cost, or faster, or better. 3 things: collaborate, discover, and connect. That's what I want you to do today. I just want to share a story with you just to illustrate the importance of you being here as leaders within the nuclear sector. In January 1976, a young jazz musician called Keith Jarrett was scheduled to do a concert at the Cologne Opera House. 3 factors conspired to make this a unique occasion. The first was the Opera House were conservative, and this was the first jazz concert that they had ever held. They decided they'd put it on after the show, so the opening time was 11:30 at night. Secondly, Keith Jarrett had asked for a particular piano to be there. It was a Bossendorfer 290 grand concert piano. This is the biggest piano you could imagine. In fact, you can buy. This is about 9 feet long. It has extra keys on the bass that give a full 8 octave. The Opera House found a Bossendorfer in the back of the place, and it was a mini grand used for practicing. It was out of tune and broken, but they thought that would be all right. It had to be tuned twice. It had to be repaired. Thirdly, Keith Jarrett had travelled that day from Zurich, where he'd played a concert. He hadn't slept. He was in back pain. He had a back brace on. And when he arrived and saw what he was facing, he pretty much refused to go on. This was a sellout concert, 1,400 people turning up at 11:30 at night to listen to him, and he's got this piano that's, not working right. He went off with his engineers to have an Italian meal, and the meal was a disaster. He eventually got back, and the young promoter of the concert, 17-year-old Vera Brander, convinced him to go on. And I read some of his words. He said, "I stood at the side of the stage, and I saw my engineers ready to record this. And I decided, I'm going to do this." And he went on, and he had to play differently. The top notes were tinny and thin. The bass didn't sound right. He played a lot in the middle. He played for over an hour, and it was recorded. In October or November that year, that recording was released. And it is still today the greatest selling solo jazz album of all time. It is also the greatest selling solo piano of any style ever. Now, if Keith Jarrett hadn't said, "Let's do it, I'm going to do it," nothing would have happened. And so, this is my challenge to you today. Unless we do something, nothing's going to change. If we don't, who will? And if we do nothing, our sector by 2030 will be reduced. This is really important to think about. Your role as leaders in this sector, the legacy you leave, the ambition for growth, that's why we're here. We have to innovate, and to innovate, we have to collaborate. So that's my challenge to you. Enjoy today, discover new things, create new collaborations, and connect that to the real world and the challenges that you face. Well, you've heard enough about me. I want you to hear what other people think about our sector. So before our second speaker, we're going to have a video. Thanks very much for listening.